Hello, I'm here with two of my good friends, Guy Senstock and Christopher Master Pietro, and we are going to discuss, probably get into a flowing dialogos about cultivating the fellowship of spiritual practice. But I'm going to let each one of them introduce themselves and how they'd like to sort of open up. So, Guy, you first, please.
Yeah. So my name is Guy Sengstock. Uh, how I came into the work in the touch point with John was through my first podcast conversation in which we had a profound conversation, out of which a couple of conversations later, including Christopher and Jordan Hall and other people, the word dialogo started to emerge on my text message. And that started to actually take some real form. And you could say that the course that we are doing, which includes uh, deeply includes a practice that I am co-founder of called circling, which is a relational practice, and it is what most people know me as is the co-founder of that practice of bringing philosophy, cognitive science, spiritual practice, philosophical practice into an ecology of practices and a real experience that involves a deep level of philiac love and fellowship. And we are going to be putting on, I think it's our fifth or sixth circling into Dialogos course, which is going to be October 21st and 22nd. That's a Saturday and Sunday. So October 21st and 22nd. And we're adjusting the times earlier for European folks. So well, especially me, because I'm on the West Coast, I'm going to be getting really early. So it'll be 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And everything is on Zoom. That's me.
That's you. All right. I am Christopher Master Pietro. As John said, I'm a writer. I'm also now, as of quite recently, the new executive director of the Vervaeke Foundation. I've been working with John alongside him for many years. And you know what I was thinking recently, John? I was thinking back to just sort of the way we developed our way of writing together, and when I think back, I didn't really think of this until recently, but it's sort of obvious now in retrospect that a lot of that process contained within it the seeds of what we would later call dialogos, because we would have these periods where we would be intensely focused on, tuning the language as we wrote, but we would have other moments when we would meet a kind of impasse. Like conceptually, we would meet an impasse, or we would stall on a problem. Like we weren't articulating something quite right, and that meant that the way that we had understood the concept wasn't quite right. So essentially, we would have a little aporia in the midst of writing, and then that would sort of throw us back into a brainstorming process. And when I think about it now, those brainstorming processes really were
Right.
spontaneous moments of dialogos. They were
Yeah.
informal. We didn't think of them that way. I don't think we ever used that word at the time. But when I think now, it's something occurred to me as well, which is, so much of that process, so much of that spontaneous, generative, creative process, which was also often very dynamic and stimulating and kind of intrinsically rewarding for its own sake, it would culminate in an insight, or it would culminate in a conclusion of, okay, what then do we actually have to write down? So all of that whole process ultimately was oriented to the goal of, finishing this sentence or finishing this paragraph or getting le mot juste for the right
Yeah.
passage. And that often felt like a victory when it came. But, I remember afterwards I would look at whatever had concretely come about as a consequence of the dialogos. And it never seemed as satisfying. I mean, it was, however appropriate it might have been, it never seemed as satisfying itself as the process was
Yeah.
of coming to it.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of, those moments when you have an insight and it leads to being able to articulate something in a way that you've never articulated it before, or finding the word that you were searching for, or finding the right phrase to describe something. And it always feels like this great victory. But I think that the victory, the thing that's actually most rewarding about it, is not having produced whatever you've produced. It was the very process that you undertook to produce it. That is actually the thing that's most gratifying and meaningful. And it's funny looking at whatever was produced in retrospect. And over time, it gradually empties out of the particular kind of effusiveness that it had in the moment of its creation. And so reflecting back on that process, it was the process rather than whatever came out of it.
Yeah.
It was truly the meaningful thing. And so that, I think now about how much that process contained within it, the very nature of what then we would develop out and you would develop out as dialogos proper and as the dialectic. So it's always nice when you can look back and reflect on what has come before and realize that there was a pattern that was being worked out, that was working itself out, even before it had been properly named. So this is all to say that the foundation now is taking the seeds of this work, this workshop that we've done now for about 2 years, and I think it's the 6th, Guy, if I'm remembering.
It is the 6th.
One of the things that it's allowing us to do is it's quite the workshop is a really a condensation of a whole bunch of different practices, a whole bunch of different courses that each expand into their own worlds. So there's of course some rudiments of circling that then expand into the art of circling that you run, Guy, out of the Circling Institute, which is really a whole world unto itself and a whole program unto itself. And of course, there's the dialectic into dialogos itself, which is now the focus of an intensive long-form course that's being run out of the Vervaeke Foundation that I'm leading with Taylor Barrett and Robert Gray. And obviously there's meditation and Neoplatonic contemplation that you have also dropped down into an independent course, John, that people can find online. And so there are all these different things that are all packed tightly together into one weekend-long program. And the novelty and the uniqueness of that workshop is that precisely that you can find all of those things together. And there is no one other place that I know of that you can find exactly that combination in that particular order and arrangement. And that comprises a kind of pattern, a particular kind of structure and journey that you can take in the span of a weekend. It's quite an intensive, but that each of those practices ultimately lead into their own worlds that feed back into that workshop. So that workshop is sort of at the center. And there's all kinds of things that are now spilling out of it and developing in their own spheres, but they all ultimately lead back to that workshop as being the origin in many ways of all of these different programs. So there's this interesting kind of world building going on where, these things are each developing out into their own and finding their fuller nature in other places that are feeding back into the workshop. And with that comes a world of people as well. And we've talked a lot about just one of the things I think has been most rewarding in doing this has just really been the people that I have met and that you guys have met, I think, too, right? Because it's an astonishingly impressive crop of people and drawn from a lot of different backgrounds and disciplines, different temperaments, too, but all, I would say, equally open and open-minded and engaging and intelligent and just willing to tumble and wrestle and willing to play. People really come to play. And the quality of those groups of people is really striking. So I know I've made some friendships out of those groups of people, and I think you guys have too. And I think ultimately, one of the things that occurs to me as we do all of this is that people are always more real than ideas.
Yeah.
And if ideas can be hosted by relationships, if the exploration of ideas becomes a feature of relating to a person, that combination is remarkably powerful. And I think it is precisely that combination that we tried to cultivate. But ultimately, the reality of the process, in my experience, is found in persons, not in ideas.
Yes.
And that's one thing I know I've learned from doing all of this.
I'm reminded that one of the consistent results we get, feedback we get from people, is they'll say things like they discovered a form of intimacy they didn't know existed, but they've always been longing for, which of course pricks up my Platonic ears quite a bit. But there's this profound sense of connectedness, which you were also, I think, alluding to when you were talking about our writing together. There's the connectedness to another person. It's interesting because people talk about that intimacy and that connectedness, and it's kind of like, well, I don't think it kind of like, I think it is an instance of a shared flow state. And I think what people are discovering is the Greek term philia, which is this fellowship together, in which they get access to something that they create together, yet nevertheless surpasses all of them. It's not just a sum of people together. They give birth together of something that draws them more into relationship with each other and into relationship together to something beyond themselves. And so people often talk about another intimacy, of course. They get the fellowship with each other, and then they get a sense of fellowship with this emerging flow of sense making and interconnectedness. And people find that profoundly rewarding. Socrates said that was the best way to live as a human being, and many people would, I think, agree with that who've participated in this. And that gives people something else, and it has these two dimensions in it. And you and I, Chris, we've talked about it: the vertical and the horizontal. The horizontal, where people really connect to other people, and connect to other people in this way that's really not afforded well in our culture. It's not, it can become, but it's not in the workshop friendship. You don't know these people, right? You don't know them. You don't know their autobiographies. You don't know their aspirational visions. You don't know their personal troubles, right? And that's not what's going to be that's not going to come to light very much in the workshop, because it's not a therapy session, right? And of course, this is not about romantic relationships at all. It's not about eros, at least of the way we understand eros, our culture. So people get this, oh, there's a way in which we should be together because we access this collective spirit. And that's the point I want to make. The interpersonal horizontal, it intermeshes with this vertical sense of spirituality, of connecting to a more encompassing way of being that's shared by a group of people, and gives them a way of grasping the world that an individual can't do, and it's a spiritual thing and so they start, and many of them who come from secular backgrounds start to talk about these experiences in their workshop, using very spiritual, even religious terms. And we're not pushing any religion here. I want to be very, very clear about that. But I want to be clear about that many people are hungering for spirituality. And that doesn't mean they want a set of religious doctrines, or they want to affirm a particular questionable metaphysical picture or anything like that. They want this sense of connectedness to what's mysteriously generative between them and beyond them, and so they're getting that too in this practice.
Yes.
In a very profound way. Guy, you wanted to say something. I could tell you're nodding.
Yeah, I mean, I just witnessed this, right, where I saw this, what you're talking about, John, which is what I'm basically hearing you say is that the fellowship, right, in the kinds of people that are drawn to the work, right, have this really, I would say, it strikes me as a unique coming together of, on one level, there's the deep interest in like the structure of being, right? The metaphysical reality, the wider cultural concerns, right? That involve like the scientific and philosophical rigor that takes, right? But also, and not at all separate from that, a deep concern for their own personal, deep, intimate development, right? In that greater context. And oftentimes you kind of see this, you see these two not come together often. Usually it's like people are, really philosophical and academic and in their head or something like that. Or you have people that are really in their feelings and, right, involved in going to therapy and immersed in their life. But there's a sweet spot, right, of these two coming together that really starts to sing. And I saw a really good example of this with somebody where it was somebody who I think he came in through dialectic into Dialogos, that then came on to the Art of Circling, which is the year-long practitioner training that I run through the Circling Institute. And he had a circle in the beginning, right, where he discussed this really intense relationship that involved him having a lot of courage with his family. It was a really intense situation, right, that involved a lot of emotion, and it was really personal to him. And there was the way that he talked about it and experienced that situation, right, in the first circle. And then there was the last circle on the last weekend, which I just experienced a couple months ago, where he talked about that same situation, right? However, there was a fundamental shift in his orientation that was so enlivening, that his situation with his sister and his family, it was deeply personal and it involved a lot of personal courage. But you could tell that there was an orientation that his personal situation was that through which he had an even deeper gaze on the structure of being. It's through the intimacy of confronting the concrete personal life with his family and everything that he had to go through, and exercising the courage of having those conversations and all that meant for him personally. But you could tell that he had a gaze that was seeing that, but seeing that as an instance, right, through which he could see his situatedness in being itself. And he was learning about existence through it, the way existence was and the structure of being. And it was such a profound difference in orientation and a transformation in a place in the very way he situated himself in the world. And it was like watching art.
Well, I just want to mention in connection with that, I was in Bergerac, France, working with many of the leaders of these emerging relational dialogical practices, and also many of the practitioners and many of the facilitators and guides. Very powerful experience. But it came away with exactly the sense of the importance of what you just put your finger on, Guy, about that. And I've been working with Chris, and we're going to loop you in soon, Guy, on a practice that we're going to workshop it and get some people to act as hopefully well-respected guinea pigs within it. And why I'm saying this is I think what you just put your finger on is really important, and this is going to go into, I hope, well, there's lots to be discussed and reflected on. But we're also working on an advanced course, an advanced workshop for dialectic and Dialogos. And we've got some ideas, and Guy and Chris and I have been talking about that. This is one of them. There's a practice that is complementary to our current dialectic and Dialogos practice that is directly about getting people to this. Can you find something that involves the whole of the self without it being self-involved, draws you deeply, all of you, but is also tremendously shareable with others? It's not egocentrically specific to you, and then therefore is a proper existential question. It involves all of you, your whole of your existence, but it calls to everybody in their existence, and a practice directly designed to afford exactly that and make it an explicit thing. And so I just want to let people know that coming to the workshop, as Chris said, there's already a whole bunch in Guy's Institute of the Vervaeke Foundation, the Awakening to Meaning. There's a whole world opened up. But for those of you who, well, I've done the workshop, and are thinking you want something more advanced, that's also in the cards. And this is the workshop is a good way of getting the rust off the wheels and getting that ready. So we'll be able to, you'll be able to participate well in the advanced course, which we're also putting together. I think the capacity for human beings to ask these kinds of questions that involve us as opposed to me or you, but involve us in a profound way, is part of what people come upon when they're doing the first workshop, this introductory Circling into Dialogos workshop. But I just wanted to let people know that we are at work. We're building an advanced course, and it will help. One of the things that we'll do is foreground this. It will also help do some shadow work, because projections are to dialogical practices what distractions are to mindfulness practices. We're going to be addressing that. So I want people to know that this workshop is part of an ongoing living creative endeavor in which we are trying more and more to help people realize these kinds of connections, ask these kinds of existential questions, confront each other and confront reality in a aspirationally nourishing fashion.
Yes.
And in a playful fashion.
Yes.
In a playful fashion, these are, they can be very, very meaningful. But there's also, they're not too self-serious, and that there's a real sense of playfulness to all of this that's really essential to it. And there's a playfulness to this much more practical and, way of doing philosophy. We think of philosophy as something you do in a scholarly way, where it's just a process of poring over volumes of historical thought. That is not what this is. It's complementary to that if you're interested in that, but ultimately does not require it. And, you said it, Guy, when you used the term art. I think Hadot said that, philosophy was simply philosophy in the sense of philia sophia, the love of wisdom, is simply the art of living well, and living with a certain orientation. And I think that's the project that we're trying to gather in this, and we're trying to gather it in this very playful and artful way, which is, how do we find, as you say, that sweet spot, that intersection where the relating to people and the relating to the dilemmas and predicaments and central confounding factors of life, where do those projects meet? Where do those projects share an identity? Where do they become the same? Right? Where is the point where the things that I face that vex me and the things that you face that vex me allow us to share in the same project and meet one another in that project in such a way that we both contribute to its opening, that we can reframe it together, that we can use one another, help one another to reorient in such a way that my life is impacted and your life is impacted, but ultimately our orientation is beyond just the scope of each of our lives. We're tapping into a greater sense of mystery, but it's pouring back in on us too. And that's why I think what you're trying to capture, John, in that there's a personal import to all of this. There's no doubt, but we're reaching beyond what is simply personal. And in reaching beyond what is simply personal, the thing that we're reaching for reaches back into us personally. It reaches back into our lives personally. It's a very difficult thing to describe, but you know it when you experience it, when you're in the throes of an interaction with someone and the bottom drops out from beneath you together and you go, whoa, something just happened. We found something together. And the thing that we found, we might find it momentarily in a phrase that's uttered, but it's not ultimately in that phrase. It's not in the language. It's something outside of the language. The language is trying to invoke it, get at it, symbolize it. But the thing that we find can't be spoken or communicated clearly. It has much more to do with the general orientation in that moment that we share that opens us to the possibility of something mysterious. And I think that's what we mean by the Socratic ignorance or the learned ignorance, right? We realized where we stand before everything that we can't adequately express. And that experience is a remarkably humbling experience, but it's a very meaningful one too. And it gets to the heart of the philosophical project, which is, you know, how we face and confront and encounter those fundamental mysteries that are unspeakable, but that can be brought into greater distinction by speaking to one another in a certain way. It's a paradox.
Yes.
What's interesting is many people describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, and I think what they are trying to articulate is that as human beings they aspire to be something more than they are, and to be connected to what's real, what are true, good, and beautiful, more than they are connected. But they find that there is no good sense of guidance on that. Many people don't know what to do, and they will often collect some practices for themselves. And those practices definitely have benefit. But we're often hungry for a North Star. We're often hungry for something that gives us a guiding way of knowing, are we getting better? Are we actually fulfilling our aspiration? And what's interesting, and I've actually participated in supervising some research that pretty clearly indicates the one thing that is predictive of you actually carrying through on your aspirations is if you internalize a role model, you internalize a sage, you internalize a moral exemplar, a virtue exemplar. Now, of course, you can endeavor to do that, but Thich Nhat Hanh said the next Buddha is the Sangha, meaning the best place we can actually look for getting a sense of that guiding orientation probably isn't going to happen by waiting around for the next Socrates or Siddhartha or even Spinoza to show up. And even if they are in the world, our world is disposed to keep them out of view for us in many ways. But what can happen in the fellowship oriented towards, as Chris is saying, and Guy is saying, this shared sweet spot of Sophia, that is, you get that sense of orientation, the spirit that emerges between everyone and between them and the orientation towards virtue. And people often describe this as a sense of awe or wonder and a renewed sense of commitment and being called. One of the things this practice can do for you then is to give you that North Star for guiding you, acting like a touchstone for you as you're engaging in your individual practices of transformation.
Yes.
We always intended it to be a meta practice in that way, a practice that you cultivate to help guide and curate your individual practice.
And through doing this, I know that for me personally, through doing this and being oriented in this deep notion of practice, is I've noticed more and more there's very few moments where practice isn't viable. Like there's an orientation that you can have where it's like we're always perceiving, we're always breathing, we're always oriented in a world. And in as John Lux is saying, the machinery, right, of that orientation, of that perception, are like you start to get a sense through these practices of the structure of that, and you can begin to play with them, right? And so one of the things I'm noticing is that just spontaneously, almost every moment, from a bike ride to looking at my kid to the way that I'm eating a meal, is this opportunity to develop a sense of the sacred somehow, right? Through attuning to a particular sensation or a particular orientation or holding in a perspective or being in a way to participate. So there's one levels where you're going to be in dialectic or circling into dialogos. You're going to be learning a series of an ecology of practices that fit together and have a progression. But there's at a meta level, you're also going to be learning practice itself, right? In that sense that life in some very deep way, at least can be such a practice at every moment.
That was beautiful, Guy. That was really beautiful.
Thank you, John.
So we are offering this, and we are offering this from our hearts and with the best of our practice. It is still very much something we are learning about as we're doing it. As I tried to indicate, this is part of an ongoing, living, creative endeavor. And we are very much, all of us, in service to the life of it and having it unfold virtuously and with virtuosity. We invite you to join us. All of us will be there. We'll be engaging in the practices and leading you through, as Guy said, step by step progression. It's this program that takes you through and it builds. And as Chris is continually and very accurately reminding us all, nothing is presupposed. You don't have to know any Greek philosophy. You don't have to know any academic philosophy. It won't hurt if you do either. But this is not expected, required, needed. You don't have to have watched Awakening from the Meaning Crisis or After Socrates, but after you do this practice, you could go back and the resources are there. We can learn more about the meaning crisis. You can learn more about the Socratic framework, but you don't need to do that and to do these practices. This is a portal. This is a portal to so much more that we have on offer for all of you. And much of this is what is on offer is free. And then some of it has a fee attached to it, but this is not a money funnel. This is not what we're trying to do. I'm not gaining from this. So we have to understand that this is something that we're trying to do with you in a very deep way.
Yeah.
And we invite your and welcome your participation. I'm going to ask if Guy and Chris have anything more to say before we wrap it up.
Yeah, I appreciate the withness that you presenced.
Lots of witnessing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Really
Very
great.
good.
Really great doing this with the two of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Likewise.
much, my friends. Okay, the record.